Good evening, and welcome to all of you to this third in a series for the fall of the Sunday at the Abbey series. It's truly my pleasure to introduce Sister Mary Reuter to you. She's a member, and I don't need to say this to you, to most of you anyway. She's a member of St. Benedict's Monastery, where she served as prioress from 1989 to 1995. She did her doctoral work at Duquesne University in formative spirituality and serves now as a professor of theology at St. Anne's and St. John's. In her teaching, she focuses on the rule of Benedict, and especially the spirituality that emerges from a creative interaction with the rule and the Gospels. She's also been the director of the Companions on a Journey, a program funded by Lily that supports the development of women at St. Anne's in their own spiritual journeys. Some years ago, I had the pleasure of working intensively with Sister Mary and Sister Emmanuel Renner on an essay entitled Catholic Benedictine Values in an Educational Environment. Okay? And the title of Sister Mary's presentation this evening is Running with an Expanding Heart, Meeting God in Everyday Life. Please give Sister Mary a warm, collegial welcome.
Well, good evening, everybody. And I was thinking on the way over here what fun it was that John gave me wide open leeway on what I could talk about. He just says, talk about your book. Okay. Sometimes that can be really scary because there are no limits, but this was fine. I could just go with it. I want to thank you for coming. It's not winter yet, so we can sneak out, and you had an extra hour of sleep last night. So even though JB is drinking coffee up here, he assures me that it's decaf. I also especially want to acknowledge and thank my sisters who are here from the monastery. And you have to know that most of them have read the book and have heard me talk about this. So that's really sisterly love and loyalty. So thank you very much. One of the first questions that I get asked about the book is, how did you come to write it? How did you work with it? What was some of the purpose behind it? So I thought I'd start out with a little bit of that background, because I think it does influence not only the structure, but also how the messages are carried out. The purpose basically is to consider how our daily experiences are places for meeting and responding to God. We meet God and we have opportunities to respond. Term that we often use for this, and it's in the document that Abbot John referred to, is a sacramental experience, a sacramental moment, a sacramental view of life. That's where we meet God and have an opportunity to respond, some kind of a loving response, courage, appreciation, perseverance, anger, just anger, that type of thing. I look at it from the point of view of Jesus interacting with daily life and the effects that has on people, and the avenue that he uses those experiences for to touch people's lives. I also talk about the rule of Benedict, since that's a tradition that I've lived in for 50 years, and I think it's done some work on me, and I've seen it work on other people. So that's a rich tradition to bring together. And I also draw from stories, literature, my own stories, other people's stories, the scriptures. Anything is fair game. And I find that the stories have been speaking to people, that emotions get involved, imagination, we're moved beyond the head. But there's a lot of head stuff in it too. When I think about it, a lot of principles underneath the stories and some of the interaction that I dialogue with those stories. Also want to talk about there are some practices that can support our living with a consciousness and a responsiveness to daily experiences. As I note in the book, it's not a how-to book, but there are a lot of questions to reflect on. There are a lot of inferences, at least, on some how-tos, but I didn't want to make it a manual. Somebody suggested having questions at the end, like a study guide. No, I didn't want it to be a manual. It's more incorporated into the whole. The kickoff point, you might say, for the book happened on October 5th, 1970. I was teaching at St. Augustine School in St. Cloud. It was morning recess, and I was called to the principal's office for a phone call. The first words I heard my brother Roger say were, "Mary, Dad just died of a heart attack." This event and the ensuing days turned my life around. What started as an ordinary teaching day changed dramatically and changed my life irrevocably. One of the key aspects for that change came from noticing people's response to my dad. We had decided that Dad wasn't a big city figure, and so there wouldn't be lots and lots of people coming to the wake. So I think we scheduled it for 6 to 9, 6 to 8, something like that. Well, people came and came and came and came. They were lined up for a block outside. And that was constant. It wasn't just a dwindle. It stayed that long. We had no prayers, no litanies, nothing. We just put the people through the opportunity to visit with my mom, or to at least shake hands with her, and to be with my dad. There were stories, many, many stories, of the encounters that these people have had with my dad. My dad had a Ford tractor, and in the spring he plowed gardens. In the summer he terraced lawns. In the fall, more terracing, and then in the winter he plowed snow. Now, I used to think he'd loved to plow snow, and I'd hear him get out with the tractor at 3 in the morning. Only later on I think what a cross that was for him to get out there and do that. But the stories that I heard of his encounters of stopping by a store and chatting with somebody that he knew, going over to the neighbors where he was digging a basement with this little Ford tractor, going over and talking to them, just every kind of everyday interaction that you might imagine. And people were telling these stories. And Dad, age 60, had made such an impression on people that, as I say, it turned my life around, and it set my life in a direction of reflection and study. One of the lines that I often find myself saying is, Dad was an ordinary man doing ordinary things. And that was very extraordinary. In my response to this, I think the biggest one was that I realized the possibilities in everyday interactions. Now, people told me that before, but something happened down in the gut, in my heart, and it didn't leave. I was blessed. That was 1970. In 1977, I left for grad school in formative spirituality at Duquesne University. And there, I entered into the topic. I knew what I was going to write about when I went. It was the formative possibilities of everyday life and the encounters of everyday life. And so I got to research and think about and study, and found out that in every tradition this is important. Got to reflect on it in my own life. Look at literature. I really felt indulgent in what I was able to study and write about. Then after coming back, I moved into teaching at the college and have done several years of that, and also facilitated retreats, wrote a few articles, and I kept finding out that people were surprised, as was I with my dad, about the possibilities in everyday experiences, that there are possibilities to deepen our relationship with God. If I'm alert, I can notice God touching my life and know God is with me. Sister Michaela just used a phrase in our recollection day yesterday about God gazing on us. I think when we're alert and catch instances where God is with us, it's like, oh, God is gazing on us, on me. Franson, I forgot his first name right now, a long time ago wrote a book, and he said that there are times in our lives when God nods his head. He uses the male language, so I'm using that. God nods his head and lets his children know that he's there. Well, that's what I find is happening with people when they begin to notice God touching their lives. It's those sacramental moments. For the title, it came quite spontaneously, and I knew exactly what I wanted. And it's Running with Expanding Heart, Meeting God in Everyday Life. The ING is important. It's a process. At first I was going to have Finding God in Everyday Life. That's the emphasis here. I'm not out there looking for God. In a way we are, but God is there. And there are those moments when we meet God, and it's an ongoing process. Every day many different opportunities happen along the way. Later on I'm going to share a story with you, but it's not always that we're running, but that's a word that Benedict uses. And I used the translation from Leonard Boyle, where he talks about run with expanded hearts. We lost that in the RB 80. I wanted something to do with running. But we run, we walk, we limp. As a friend of mine says, we slog it out. We skip. Any of those kind of verbs, depending upon what's going on in our lives, can be the word that we could use. One of the purposes in the way I wrote the book is to enable you, the reader, to dip into your own experiences. I prefer people do not stay with mine. Let your imagination, let your memory go to your own experiences. And I usually suggest people to read slowly, kind of lectio, but not with mine. You can a little bit, but go to your own experiences. There's one person in the room, I won't look at her right here, but she said she read the whole book in one sitting. And then she said, now I'm going to go back and just take it a little bit at a time. So you can do that too if you want to. For the structure of the book, I knew I wanted to use everyday experiences, and I didn't know quite what to do, and so I thought, I'm going to take, each chapter is through a particular lens. The first one is Everything is Holy, and there you find the story of my dad in more detail. One is on a parable experience, that we have break-in experiences, God breaks into our lives, and that's what I want to develop a little bit later. Another one is on hospitality, listening, and it's listening, discerning, and responding are the three elements of obedience. That responsible obedience as a Christian, obedience as a Benedictine, calls for those that we listen, and it's that listening, mindful attitude that we walk through life, but also be attuned to what's going on. I know somebody that's in the midst of making a decision about whether or not she can continue a certain ministry. And I just heard from her today, and she said, I've decided that this is the last time I'm going to do this. It's something out of the country. I'm finding that my body can't take it. But she's been listening to this for at least the last year, and now it's clear. And so there's that type of listening related to decision making, but also the listening that I talked about before that helps us be alert to God touching our lives, entering our lives. There's a chapter on stability. There's a chapter on crisis, and I'll say a little bit more about that afterwards. And then I end with contemplative living. However, I really believe that when these qualities are active, we're living contemplatively, that the world, our world, is a holy place. Contemplative, the base word temple, holy, that it's a holy place and we live in it as a holy place. And in that chapter, I refer to one of our sisters, Sister Merrill, who walks around in a way saying her own psalms. That's the best way I can say it. And those of us that know her know what that is. Another one that was in stability, I talked about Sister Suzanne, who died just recently. And again, everybody knows. Yeah, that's right. And she could have been in this last chapter too. When in community, this could be our parish community, monastic community, families, these people that are farther along in the journey than we are can be such inspirations to us. And when I see the work that life has done on them and for them and with them, it gives me great hope. And these people are models for us about contemplative living. Okay, moving into a little bit of the content. When I talk about everyday life, I'm talking about the events and processes we take for granted that we do habitually. I probably spent about half a day when I was doing my doctoral work of just looking up the word ordinary and all the spin-offs on that. It's very interesting, but the word order is in there. Ordinary life, we have a certain order, so it becomes routine, mundane, because we just take it for granted. Could be very boring, and so we're looking for something else. What we're going to find in some of the examples I'm going to use is that when God breaks in on us, life somehow, the Spirit comes into our lives, that order gets broken into and shifted. And that's where some opportunity is. Part of the opportunity also is, just to hang in there with that routine. But that sometimes takes some discernment. How long do you stay in that? When looking at Jesus and his perspective of everyday encounters, we saw them as opportunities to love, to serve, to allow the Holy Spirit to enter into people's lives. And I like to think of Jesus' own heart expanding. The heart is a muscle, and with each experience, it expands. It gets stronger. And so Jesus walks the way wherever he is, and he encounters people. He taught, and he modeled. But one of the things that I like to look at in some of the stories is how he met people. The respect, sometimes confrontation, in relation to integrity. He looked at them, the little details. He looked at them with compassion. He engaged them. He saw them, even when the apostles were trying to keep them out of sight. And as a result, they were physically healed, emotionally healed, just maybe feeling more whole, being more whole as human beings. So his encounters are an inspiration for us, and the Spirit helps it to happen in our own lives, that as we encounter people, we touch them, we heal them, we challenge. And lots of times that's happening to ourselves too. We're experiencing healing, challenge. Jesus involved himself in the usual tasks and encounters of his daily life. He didn't sit in an office all day. There are lots of daily experiences in an office too, or classroom. Ordinary things and gestures served as ways of giving life, of celebrating what we might consider ordinary time. For example, he broke bread and people were fed. He touched the eyes of a blind man and he could see. From noticing how a seed sprouts and grows, he learned about the dying and rising pattern of life. He taught these insights to people. Yeast and bread dough, mustard trees, and a woman looking for a lost coin all became the basis of his parables. Jesus' familiarity with the seeds and types of soil gave him images for stories that urged the listeners to cultivate their inner soil to receive a life-shifting message and to nurture their growth. I realize, just as I'm saying this, that I think this is why Abbot John likes the parables so much. That they're very earthy and some of them have to do with seeds and soil. Paul Reuter, a philosopher, says this about the ordinariness of the images and that Jesus uses. He says they are radically profane stories. Now, he's not making a distinction here of holy, not holy. They're just ordinary stuff of life. They are radically profane stories. There are no gods, no demons, no angels, no miracles. No time before time, as in the creation stories. Not even founding events, as in the Exodus account. Nothing like that, but precisely people like us. Palestinian landlords traveling and renting their fields. Stewards and workers. Sowers and fishers. Fathers and sons. In a word, ordinary people doing ordinary things. Selling and buying. Letting down a net into the sea, and so on. Here resides the initial paradox. On the one hand, these stories are narratives of normalcy, but on the other hand, it is the kingdom of God that is said to be like this. The paradox is that the extraordinary is like the ordinary. One of the realizations I keep coming to when I reflect on this focus is if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. That there's something in these encounters that is valuable, and I would say holy. One other area that we look at Jesus, and that is his interaction with family. I think that's helpful for all of us in our family interactions, and we know the Mary, Martha, Lazarus relationship, sometimes with his mother. One of the elements that we deal with, though, is that we tend to want the extraordinary and the dramatic. And when I noticed, I don't watch much television, but when I do, it's like I'm so struck with the biggest, the greatest, the fastest, the newest, whatever. And so it's drilled into us. It's in the water we swim in. So it's hard not to be that way, but there's also something tending inside of us that probably pushes us that way. None of us wants our life to be only a whimper. We want to be noted. There's a play that I saw maybe 20 years ago that is, I just love it, and I keep going back to it. Pippin. Pippin is on a life journey, and he's exploring all kinds of things, and he's just trying to find what's really going to be significant. And he finally settles down and marries a woman who has a little boy. And the little boy's probably, get the sense he's about 3 or 4 years old. And going along pretty well, and then he starts getting restless. He doesn't have the commitment to stability yet. But he gets restless, and he wants to take off again, and he says, there's got to be more life to life than ducks. And changing diapers, and doing this, and this, and this. And so he takes off. And at the very end of the play, they challenge him, here's your chance to be great. Go up on stage, and we're going to burn you. It's like being burned at the stake, and just think you'll be glorious. People will never forget you. And it's like, whoa. But the message is along in that story. It's a musical. And the messages in that story, I think, show the struggle that we all have in terms of, is this all there is? That's one of the lines in there. Is this all there is? And in a way, yeah. This is all there is. The other side of it is, there's a lot more. There's a lot more, and there's a lot more in this daily stuff. Can we see something beyond? Can we trust that there's something in the area of relationship that's happening? And that the Spirit is working somehow in these people. That's the more in these everyday experiences. So we look at moms and dads, friends, teachers, business people doing everyday activities as they bring love to God's people. They provide openings through which the Spirit breathes into the world. They give opportunities for Christ to continue engaging in ordinary life situations. This morning, Father Jonathan Licari presided at Eucharist for us, and at the end of his homily, he gave a line that really struck people because I've heard it a couple times. He said, we need to do everyday things for everyday people. I thought, well, he's right on target for the theme for today. quick glance at Benedict. St. Benedict of Nursia also heard Jesus' message and put an emphasis on the daily, on what happens in everyday life. He sees Christ embodied in people and in situations. For example, he provides for how to deal with guests, how to welcome guests, that they feel welcome, but also that the community is protected in terms of having too many guests. In the poor, in the sick. In fact, he even says, sick, don't be a pain in the neck. Don't be crabby. These people are taking care of you, so don't make it hard. In the abbot and prioress. And the baseline here again is that Christ is in the other, and we are to be Christ to that person. Christ is in this situation. I'm just going to refer to these. I'm not going to open them up, but I want to just provide enough of a context. Related to this, Benedict also saw that all things are to be handled graciously, carefully. The cleaning utensils, all things are to be treated as vessels of the altar. I'm just going to read a line from the book that I experienced some of this just recently. I thought, yep, it's right on. We all know the challenge of acting responsibly when things belong to everyone, and no one in particular, such as emptying the water out of the iron, picking up waste paper from the floor, washing the dirty dishes instead of leaving them in the sink, and replenishing cooking supplies. It's all related to things and how we relate, and they're also connected with how we respect and relate with each other. But because the material world is God's creative work, it deserves respect and responsible use by us as stewards. I'm going to move now into saying a little bit about the parables and then use an example. I found that the parables, especially the purpose of the parables, served well what I've been reflecting on and the way I see life experiences happening. The parables are stories of interruptions, of God breaking into people's lives. Jesus told them to change that order, that ordinary way of thinking and looking at life, to change it, and then possibly come up to another response. It could be an action, it could be a way of looking at something, it could be an attitude. Some of the actual parables are a shift, show a shift, such as this one. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy, he goes out. I want to just point out, he found it, so that broke the order. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. I'm not going to open that up, but it's the pattern. He's walking along, discovers something, and then changes. One time in a workshop, we used this, and I just said, what did he find? What did he do with it? It was amazing the kind of things that people came up with. It was a group of oblates, and I think you remember it, Helen. One of them, I remember, that's really struck me, said, oh, this person found this really peaceful place in the woods where she could get away from everything. And it was so beautiful and peaceful, and the energy there was so great that she wanted it, but also to share with other people. So she took the steps she needed to buy it. And then I don't remember what she did with it, but it was something for herself and other people. It's an interesting experience to do with people, to see what's there. Bring it into contemporary situation. What was found? I'm going to use an example from the book, and I'm just going to read it. I think that's the best way to do it, to illustrate this type of, I keep using one of your word, break-in. Interruption, opening up an experience. This is called Rich with Pennies. When I am tempted to doubt the value of everyday encounters, I often recall Annie Dillard's book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She says, there are lots of things to see, unwrapped gifts, and free surprises. The world is studded and strewn with pennies. Dillard explains that these pennies are the simple, hardly noticeable events in life, events we might disdain and see as unimportant. However, she also points out that we don't get excited by a mere penny nowadays. A friend of mine doesn't pick up pennies anymore. She believes that with the current rate of inflation, it's not worth bending over to get it from the ground. She winces when I remind her that Dillard says we need to, quote, cultivate a healthy poverty and simplicity so that finding a penny will literally make our day. Some experiences will remain pennies, some will make us rich. A few years ago, I stopped at a local craft store to get a frame for a photo my brother had given me. I found one. It was an exact match of color, and the price was right. But I couldn't tell if my photo would fit in the frame. It had a wide, white margin around it, a border I planned to trim according to the size of the frame. I went to the framing service to get a tape measure. A young woman had placed a shadow box and a couple of tiny baby items on the counter. Among the items was a short white tape measure. Perfect, I thought. I asked if I could use it to check my photo with the frame. She held back and said, "It's my baby's." I felt affronted. Sarcastically, I thought, maybe she's afraid of my getting germs on the tape. I caught my irritation, and deciding not to leave in such a negative state, I engaged in a few words of conversation. When I commented appreciatively about the items displayed in the shadow box, the woman thanked me and said she wanted advice from the framing consultant about how to attach the items. The clerk took her to the adhesive shelf to point out some tapes that would work. Then she returned and helped me. The young woman and I met again at the checkout counter. I commented, "I see you found some tape for your project." "Yes," she said, "but it's so hard." I must have looked puzzled. She went on to say, "My baby boy died." Something stabbed my stomach. I told her I was sorry and asked how old he was. 5 months. He was stillborn. What could I say? I mumbled, "I'm sorry." Remembering that one of the items of her for her shadow box was a picture of Christ as a good shepherd, I presumed she was Christian, so I added my commitment to pray for her. She thanked me and walked out, and I choked down my tears and left for home. I found a penny when my need for the tape measure or ruler drew me into conversation with the woman. I quickly noticed a deeper poverty, my irritation. The later conversation with the young woman at the checkout counter was an added gift. I gained an understanding of her situation and entered into it emotionally. Humility grounded me as I realized my self-righteousness in judging her reactions when I asked her to use the tape measure. I also felt the armor of my defensiveness collapse. The world is indeed studded and strewn with pennies. I'm glad I picked up those I found at the craft store. I left the store a rich woman. Furthermore, I had met Christ who was suffering, and in the midst of pain, I received the healing of compassion, even though I was bruised with embarrassment about my hostile thoughts. As I reflected on the incident, I have grown in hope that my caring encounter brought some consolation to this suffering Christ. I realize, too, that I can bring Christ's healing compassion to people and the rest of creation. This event actually has 2 break-in points. One at the counter when I'm looking for the tape measure, and then again at the checkout counter. Paul Reuter again gives us some help in the structure of some of the parables, and also the purpose of parables. You have an encounter with a person, a thing, something happens. It's usually a combination of those elements. It can cut through what we're thinking about, what we're doing. We could be kind of distracted. We might be compulsively rushing through something, half awake, actually kind of looking and maybe even studying and reflecting on a topic, and then all of a sudden the light goes on. Something strikes us and catches our attention. Then there's a reversal or a change of heart. It could be a slight degree, or it could be something dramatic, to a dramatic degree. And again, that could be a change in perception, attitude, action. And thirdly, there's a decision to act in accord with what is valued. There's action that comes from it. In this instance, in this example, the first encounter was the woman, and probably even more than her, the tape measure. And I still remember, just reading it again, the feelings come back like, ugh. I'm not contagious with anything. It was my first judgment. So that was part of the encounter. And then there's a thought that came along with it when I noticed my irritation, that I don't want to leave this situation feeling irritated. She might not have known that and wouldn't know the difference, but I did. And there's friction here in the relationship. And so I wanted to make peace in a way, so I struck up a conversation. And I actually felt sincere about that. I wasn't just kind of pasting over it so that I could feel better. I thought, come on, get a hold of yourself here. Let's act here with respect. And I found myself recentering myself. And one of the results of this is actually this way of even engaging in the conversation is part of the decision, the action. But another part of the reaction or the result of it is that I became more convinced than ever about respect in communication, in relationships, that if we notice something is irritated, check it out, or do something to re-engage something here. Then the other break-in was at the counter. I met her again. And the reversal certainly came when I found out the death of the child. I mean, and I wasn't expecting that at all, and so it really hit deep. So talk about reversal or change of heart. And then my action was, in response to her, pick up the Good Shepherd theme, praying for her. But it also has, again, deepened my resolve. And that's part of the fruit of an experience like this. Deepened my resolve to maybe not jump to conclusion quite as fast, to be compassionate, to feel compassion for a broader breadth of people. Lots of people are suffering from something like this, and even if I don't know them, I can still hold them in my heart, and it's expanding of my heart. So that's one way that I see some of the parallel with the parables. Incidentally, on the table back there, I have some copies of a guide sheet that you might want to look at in terms of looking at one of your own experiences with this pattern in regard to a parable. But a couple other people, I'm just going to throw out a couple themes to see how other people look at it. Theologian John Taylor talks about these break-in moments as annunciation moments initiated by the Spirit. And he says, they open to us the beauty of the world, the truth of ideas, the pain of disappointment and deformity. I want to add on to that, though, that I really see that when we're looking at the pain, opening the pain, it also gives us a chance to experience pain and joy. I don't want to use negative, positive, the feelings we like and the feelings we don't like, because those are human. And with the pace of life, it's amazing how our emotions are getting squashed. Watch TV, And by the time you get to an emotional part, there's a break for a commercial. You know, our emotions don't even have a chance to get revved up lots of times. Or if they do, they're jerked out by an ad or a switch in scene. Or if I'm with somebody and all of a sudden they're using the remote and change to a different channel, what? Where'd we go? I was into that story. So when we can experience those feelings, it's part of being human and vulnerable and joyful and creative. And I want to do everything we can to get those back or to get them deeper. We've talked about sacramental moment. That's another point on it. One area that I talk about in the book is the Irish use of the word thin places, that these kinds of experiences are thin places. And the examples that I found in some of the literature I've looked at are like beauty spots, like fall is wonderful because you come onto a sumac bush that's in the sunshine, or you see a beautiful leaf. It's like, you move to awe and wonder. God is near, God is here. I think it's also, we can apply that to the painful experiences. I was working with someone who had read the book and she was going through some hard things, and she'd come in and she'd say, I'm in a thin place. And it was a hard one. Or sometimes it was wonderful. Ooh, I had a thin place today. I just experienced a thin place. It's neat when that happens. We can name it and become more conscious of it. Vincent Smiles gave the presentation here in October. And in a way, it was like one of these interruptions. He was talking about Bible and science. And one of the things he said that I haven't had a chance to explore yet is he said, what he got me thinking about was that we flatten experiences. When we're just going through life, kind of rote, I'm doing this and doing this, they're flat. I don't have the sense of imagination, emotion, hope, anticipation for the future. And so all those dimensions of our human experience aren't there. Sometimes it's survival. I made it to the end of the day, or I made it through this meeting. And so I don't know, I don't have any solutions for that, but I think the issue is that in a way that's really something that has happened. So how can we get the depth of our experience? Because it's in all of that God is acting and God is inviting, and we get to respond. And then just one other idea I'll point out in the book, if you want to watch for it, I think it's toward the end. I know it's toward the end. Karl Rahner talks about everyday mysticism. That's kind of paradoxical when you think of it that way. Okay, a couple comments. And then I'm going to just say a little bit about Benedict and then open it up for a break and some conversation. I mentioned crisis earlier, and there's a whole chapter on crisis. Crisis is ordinary. When we're in it, we don't think so. Why do I have to be going through this? I especially learned this a number of years ago when my mother was getting weaker, and we knew that going to assisted living was going to be coming soon. And I was knitzing about it and whining about it, and one of my younger brothers said, you know, it's our turn. What? Lots of people have to deal with this. This is our turn. Oh. So it's ordinary. It's an ordinary part of the whole sequence of life. Because it's so painful, it seems extraordinary, or not high extraordinary, but we don't want it. It's part of ordinary life, and it can be a gift in terms of what I was talking about with that break-in of the spirit, the break-in where we get to look at life and make some choices. Crises go deeper, and you can't get out of it very fast, and you have to stay in it, and you get to see more, and you get to make more choices. And so it follows the same kind of pattern. I'll look for it later. There's a wonderful quote about it, it was Jacques Maritain talked about one of the things that we lose is trying to get out of our crisis too fast. Or in one day when we're feeling kind of in the dumps or something happened, I want to forget about it. No, what about staying in it and let it speak to us? That's where some of the richness and the insights can come. In these patterns that we're talking about, some of the break-in are slight, and some of them are dramatic. And it can be ecstasy type of experiences or the tragedy, crisis type of experience. They don't all have to be the same degree of impact. And also, what I find is that sometimes when I'm working with students and they really want to get conscious, and so they're really good at this, and it becomes a task. Nah, stay relaxed, stay kind of attentive, but not fully engaged all the way. I also mentioned that sometimes we're slogging our way through, sometimes we're walking our way through. This is a picture that to me demonstrates it. This statue, I point to this, I'm sorry, the statue up there, is the Walking Madonna. It's at Salisbury Cathedral. I found out that there's one at De La Salle, it's either University or College North Philadelphia also. And the saying on the postcard where I met her was, "Walking with purposeful compassion as a member of the community of the risen Christ to bring love where love is absent." And somehow that really struck me. That was one of those break-in moments, and I've reflected on that a lot. One of my friends went over, and I said, "Would you take some more pictures of it so I get some other angles?" Which he did. And I looked at the pictures, and one day I looked at it, and this one just jumped out at me. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a woman way over in the background. So, who's got the vigor of bringing the risen Christ to people? She's limping. I love it that she's got a similar posture to the main statue. Is she to be discredited because she's not out there? Actually, I discovered this when I needed to give a reflection to our sisters over at St. Scholastica, our retirement center, for one of the Jubilee celebrations. And I think that was the context that somehow this jumped out. And I thought, these people there are walking with purposeful compassion. And the key basis for that I think is important is that it's fidelity, it's faithfulness in doing whatever pace we can. That's really important. Just a couple points from Benedict, and then I'm going to stop. Benedict provides interruptions. And life gives us interruptions. We talk about the school of life. Benedict talks about the school for the Lord's service. We have liturgy of the hours. We have meals. Families have children, and they do not respect what time of day or night it is when they want what they want. We have events that happen. One of the phrases that I'm finding very helpful to help me when I feel a little irritated with stuff happening, life happens. Okay, relax. I use the weaving as an image here because we can look at some of the qualities about our life as monastics, but it fits everybody, that we can highlight it, but then they're all woven together, which is a little bit misleading when you start talking about one of them. So, for example, stability. Stable within ourselves, stable in our relationships with other people, some degree of community, stable in a relationship with God. Sometimes we're unstable because there's a growing edge happening. Stable within nature and trying to keep the world in nature in balance. Absolutely important for these experiences to be able to touch us. And I think along with stability is mindfulness, some kind of reflectiveness, so that I always say I don't need a crisis for God to get my attention. Sometimes I do. But, the daily stuff, let God get us on those daily experiences. Hospitality, openness to the break-in wherever they come from. There's listening, that inner reflectiveness, and then that keeps discerning so that I make conscious responses, not reactions, responses. That can I bring some attentiveness to the experience so that I'm Again, even being human in terms of making some choices. Practices, prayer, lectio, moderation. Some of our seasons of the church, Advent, Lent, quiet. When I think of quiet, I recall a line from Rachel Riemann in her book, My Grandfather's Blessings. If you ever want something that's good, like just before going to bed, about two and a half pages, her book will help you out. She's a psychotherapist and gives these stories, and without saying the moral of the story is, or the lesson is, you get it. Something hits you. In there, she says that we are given many more blessings than we receive. And one of her clients told her that it's like an airplane circling the airport in the landing field, going round and round and round, waiting for a way to land. So in our attentiveness gives those blessings a chance to land. And I think some of us maybe just go off into outer space because we're not there. So in closing, my hope for you is that your reflection, and just this reflection here together, can lead you to notice more of your daily experiences and let them speak to you, let God touch you through them. Because God's always gazing at you, but sometimes you can catch it. Thanks.